Director of FGCU Scholars, also Associate Professor in Biology. And I'm just going to be going through some preliminary results we have regarding a mid-year assessment we did of critical thinking skills as shown by students in Composition 1, our first semester, first year course in terms of writing, critical thinking, and information literacy, as well as University Colloquium, which is a university-wide course to engage students in topics of sustainability. We did this for a variety of reasons, not least of which we want to understand how these students develop these skills, but we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we want to understand how different modalities might be influencing learning gains and how experience of instructors might be affecting learning gains. So, between December 16th and December 18th, we ran 2 concurrent virtual assessments. In Composition 1, we were primarily looking at any differences that might exist between face-to-face, synchronous, and asynchronous approaches. And this assessment was done by faculty assessors only. And then University Colloquium, we were interested in looking at how a faculty's experience with online teaching might affect student learning gains and performance. And in this case, we're looking at both faculty and student assessors. Basic overall finding, and I'll talk about the data in just a few minutes, but that students in asynchronous sections in Composition 1 showed smaller learning gains than those in either face-to-face or synchronous sections. And those 2 approaches, face-to-face and synchronous, those students showed very similar performance. So the online and face-to-face were basically the same so long it was live. Asynchronous, less well developed. In terms of Colloquium, faculty that were new to online teaching, those students showed higher learning gains than faculty who had experience with online teaching, and that surprised me quite a bit, to the point where I had to re-look at that figure multiple times before I actually saw it and look at the numbers to make sure I was seeing what I was seeing. What appears to be going on is that there's some evidence that shows that faculty that were new to online teaching and those that were experienced that pursued professional development opportunities to help with their instructions, those students in those sections did better versus the faculty that were experienced and didn't pursue extra professional development opportunities this past semester. Again, we'll take a look at those information. So this is kind of a similar figure that we'll see quite a bit. We're going to have along our x-axis, we'll have the parameters we're looking at. On y-axis, we'll have a composite score of learning along a scale of 0 to 40. Each dot in this case represents an individual single score for a student's critical thinking. And we measured 4 criteria. We measured the ability to explain an issue. We measure the student's position about that issue. We measure their ability to use evidence, and then how they applied and concluded all of that information. So each dot represents the average of those 4 scores. And we have box linguistical plots, so we have our medians, these bold lines, we have our 25th to 75th percentile, and then basically have your range, 1.5 quartile, but basically your range. And what you can see here is that students in a synchronous environment perform just as well as those students in a face-to-face environment. And that includes the fact that one of the sections of face-to-face were honor students. So about 60 samples came from that honor section. This pattern of similarity stayed even when you removed those honor students. And in both cases, we saw higher learning gains in the synchronous and face-to-face section than we saw in the asynchronous section. What you're looking at here is you're looking at the performance across these 4 different criteria. And what we're seeing is that students had a better time explaining the issue than they had an ability to use evidence and then apply, make conclusions about that information. So they can explain what the topic is more appropriately than they can think through their own conclusions and use evidence in order to develop their ideas. 2 important skills, especially that issue of evidence, that we do want to continue working on. In terms of Colloquium, again, it's a surprising observation. Same basic figure, each dot represents a student along a benchmark for an average of 4 criteria. And what we see is those faculty that were new to online teaching, those students showed higher learning gains than those faculty that had experience with online teaching. Again, these are all synchronous instructions except for one section in Colloquium, and there was basically a 22% difference in the overall student performance. That's striking. Also a little surprising. What appears to be going on is an issue of professional development. The director of Colloquium, Brenda Thomas, provided an opportunity called Blueprint, which was a professional development tool to help faculty integrate asynchronous instructions more effectively within Colloquium. For those faculty that participated in that professional development, their students showed higher learning gains than those faculty that did not. There's a lot of variation, but the overall trend was improved learning when the faculty took that extra effort for their professional development. That's awesome. Again, when we look across the 4 criteria, in this case what we're seeing kind of slight improvement in terms of both explaining the issue and the students demonstrating their position. Then again, this issue of using evidence and application. So what we're kind of noticing, and we've noticed it even through the past 5 years of the QEP assessments, is using evidence is very difficult, and synthesizing information to make sort of an impactful conclusion is very difficult. And these are skills that we want to further develop in our students, in particular that issue of evidence. There's so much misinformation out there. We do have sort of a fiduciary responsibility to make sure our students can weed through information and then use the information appropriately for different situations. So keep up the hard work. We'll take a little bit of time comparing student and faculty assessors. In Colloquium, we had both formats, and these are each paired figures. And there's a lot of business in figures, but they're pretty straightforward. What you're looking at here is the faculty responses. What you're looking at here are the student responses for each of our measured criteria: student's position, explanation of the issues, application and conclusion, evidence. And what you're looking at here is a dot representing the average score for the faculty that assessed an artifact, and the same dot for that same artifact that was assessed by the student assessors. And the line describes the overall slope. And look at the lines. If the lines are all going up, it means that students assessed their peers higher than faculty. If the lines are all going down, then it means faculty assessed the students higher than the other assessors. But if the lines are this garbled mix, some are going up, some are going down, what it means is basically our student and faculty assessors were looking at these artifacts in very similar ways, and that's exactly what we see. We see no overall difference in how the faculty assessors treated these artifacts and how the student assessors looked at these artifacts, which is really good information to help us understand that there is a lot of consistency and continuity between what is being produced in these artifacts and the degree of learning that we're seeing in these artifacts. In addition, faculty and student assessors kind of saw the same basic pattern across our 4 criteria. Both faculty and student assessors thought there was higher learning gains in terms of explanation of issues and student position than in terms of application conclusions and evidence. So we're seeing the same basic pattern. In fact, you can almost say that this is sort of a good, strong replicant to show the overall pattern of performance. Finally, one thing we did see a little bit of differences, and this is me being geeky, this is no one else. We did see greater conformity associated with the norming. So we started assessment in the morning with the norming discussion, where we come to terms, where we try to understand what the actual rubric is saying, and we try to agree on the overall sort of description and situation for each of these. And in those cases, faculty did do a little bit better during the norming process. There was more agreement in terms of how they scored artifacts than the students. And you can see that because on average, we tend to have these positive slopes, which means in this case, the degree of difference between the 2 sets of artifacts, students were higher. In this assessment, we got a lot to learn from this. We're now having conversations with students and faculty to better try to tease these out so that what we're able to do with these assessments is use them as a tool to improve all our instructional activity and therefore the overall learning gains of students from first year to graduation. Thank you.